They called me a gold digger the day I married him. His family laughed at my greasy hands, my simple clothes, my life as a mechanic. They said I wasn't worthy of their world. But what they didn't know was that one day I would save their empire, expose their greatest enemy, and become the woman they would never stop respecting. Before I tell you how I went from being underestimated to becoming the woman who saved an empire, let me ask you this. Have you ever been judged for being too simple, too ordinary, too different? If this story speaks to you, don't forget to like this video, subscribe for more stories of resilience and courage, and share it with someone who needs to remember that their worth is greater than the world's opinion. My name is Tanya, and for most of my life people defined me by what I wasn't. I wasn't rich. I wasn't glamorous. I wasn't the kind of woman people noticed when she walked into a room. I was simple. And I carried that label like a second skin, not because I believed it meant less, but because I had no choice. My world was small, loud, and full of engines. I grew up in a modest neighborhood where my father owned a little garage. When he passed away, the garage became my inheritance, my responsibility, and in a way, my anchor. While other girls dreamed of makeup counters and glittering dresses, I found comfort in the smell of motor oil, in the hum of an engine I could bring back to life. Most days were the same. Customers came in with broken-down cars, I rolled up my sleeves, and I did my work. My hands were rough from years of turning wrenches, and sometimes when I caught sight of myself in the mirror, I wondered if the grease stains ever really washed away. People said it wasn't a woman's job, that I should have chosen something easier, softer, something fitting. But the garage was the only place where I felt strong, where every problem had a solution if you looked close enough. Then came the day everything changed. I remember it clearly because the sun was high and heavy, making the tin roof of my shop burn like fire. I had just finished fixing an old pickup when a sleek car rolled into the garage, so shiny it reflected the clouds like a mirror. I recognized it instantly. It was the kind of car that cost more than my shop itself. When the door opened, out stepped a man who looked like he belonged in another world entirely. His suit was pressed, his shoes polished, his watch gleaming under the light. He carried himself with a confidence that made the air around him shift, as though everyone else existed just to orbit his space. His assistant was in a panic, waving his hands about how they were late for an important meeting, how the car had just stopped in the middle of the road. But he didn't look rattled. He just looked curious, almost amused as his eyes swept over my small shop, landing finally on me. I thought he would dismiss me with a glance, maybe demand someone else. Instead, he gave a small nod, as if he was ready to see what I could do. The problem with his car wasn't complicated. It was something small, a misaligned part that most people wouldn't have noticed, buried beneath shiny surfaces that distracted the eye. But I noticed. Mechanics are about details, about listening to the whispers of a machine when everyone else only hears silence. Within minutes, I had the engine purring again. His assistant looked relieved. But the man? He just watched me with a kind of interest that unsettled me. "You're different," he said simply. I laughed, trying to shake off the intensity of his gaze. "I'm just a mechanic." But even as I said it, something in his expression told me he didn't agree. I didn't know it then, but that moment, the exchange of those few words, would mark the start of a story no one could have written for me. Not the neighbors who called me simple, not his family who later called me a gold digger, not even me, the girl who thought she'd never belong anywhere beyond the smell of grease and gasoline. That day, without realizing it, I had stepped into a new world, and he had stepped into mine. When we decided to marry, I thought love would be enough. Isn't that what the world tells us? That if two people truly care for each other, the rest doesn't matter? But I was naive to believe that love alone could silence whispers, or that a signature on a marriage certificate would erase the doubts in people's hearts. The wedding was small. My idea, not his. He would have gladly filled a ballroom with chandeliers and cameras, but I wanted something intimate. A few friends, a handful of his family, and vows spoken simply. He looked at me as though I was the only woman on earth, and in that moment, I believed I was. But even as we smiled for pictures, I caught the way his mother's lips pressed tightly together, the way his sister whispered behind her hand, the way a few relatives avoided my gaze entirely. I told myself it didn't matter. I told myself their opinions couldn't touch me. But opinions have a way of seeping into the cracks, like water finding weakness in stone. And soon enough, I began to hear the words they tried to keep hidden. Gold digger. Opportunist. Outsider. They thought I didn't hear. They thought their voices were safe when they spoke behind closed doors, but walls have ears, and sometimes those ears are mine. One evening, I was walking down the hallway when I overheard his mother saying, "She'll ruin him. She doesn't belong in this family. She only wants his money." My chest tightened, but I kept walking, silent. At family dinners, I felt the weight of their stares. They asked questions that weren't really questions. "So, Tanya, how does a mechanic adjust to our lifestyle? Do you miss your garage?" Their tones dripped with mockery, as if fixing cars was a sin that stained me permanently. I would smile politely, answering with as much grace as I could muster, while my husband's hand would squeeze mine under the table, a quiet reassurance that he was on my side. But being on my side didn't erase the battles I fought silently. Every insult felt like a test I hadn't studied for. Every glance reminded me that I was a stranger in their world, walking halls I was never meant to walk. Sometimes I wondered if they were right, if maybe I was too simple, too ordinary, too unpolished to stand in a house of glass and gold. Still, I endured, because leaving wasn't an option, and proving myself with words felt hollow. I believed that time would soften their edges, that one day they might see me not as a threat, but as a woman who loved him. But I underestimated how far resentment can go when it festers unchecked. What I didn't know then was that their disapproval would soon find an ally, someone far more dangerous than whispered words and sharp glances, a villain who would not only question my place in his heart, but also my role in his world. And when he arrived, the real storm began. It was during those uneasy months of marriage, when the sting of my in-laws' disapproval still burned, that he entered our lives. At first, I didn't see him for what he was. Villains rarely arrive wearing masks. They arrive wearing smiles. His name was whispered with respect around the dinner table. He was my husband's cousin, a man who had grown up alongside him, studied with him, and worked in the family's shadow. To the world, he was family. To me, he soon became the shadow that followed every step I took. He shook my hand the first time we met, holding my gaze for a moment too long. There was charm in his voice, a smoothness in his tone that made people listen. He praised the food, complimented the house, laughed at every joke. But beneath all of it, there was something sharp, something calculating in his eyes, like he was already 2 moves ahead in a game I didn't know we were playing. He treated me politely in public, but his words carried edges that cut when no one else noticed. "A mechanic," he once said with a smile. "How refreshing." So different from what this family is used to, everyone else laughed. I just lowered my gaze and swallowed the bitterness in my throat. What I didn't know was that he had already started weaving his web. Slowly, he planted seeds of doubt in the family's mind. He whispered that I was too ambitious, that I was using my husband to gain access to the company, that soon I would push them all aside and claim what wasn't mine. And because they already doubted me, they believed him. His lies didn't have to be loud. They only had to be timely. I began to notice the change. The glances grew colder. Conversations stopped when I entered a room. Even his mother, who had once only mocked me quietly, now spoke openly of her fears. "She'll destroy this family," she said one evening. "She wants control." At first I thought it was only gossip. Families do that. They talk, they exaggerate. But then I realized it wasn't just talk. The cousin had positioned himself as a savior, a man who cared for the company's future while painting me as a threat. My husband trusted me, but I could see the doubt in his eyes some nights. Not about my love, but about the cost of keeping me by his side. The villain didn't strike all at once. He was patient. He waited for cracks to widen, for storms to build. He smiled at family dinners while slipping poison into conversations. He pretended to care about me while ensuring that others questioned everything about me. It wasn't until the company itself began to stumble that I understood the depth of his intentions. The crisis that followed wasn't an accident. It was carefully crafted. And when the walls began to close in, I realized that his plan was not just to destroy my place in the family, but to bring the entire empire to its knees. And somehow, he made it look like I was the cause. The first signs of trouble in the company came like faint cracks in a wall, easy to dismiss at first, but impossible to ignore once they spread. A delayed project here, a canceled contract there. At board meetings, tension hung in the air like smoke. My husband tried to reassure everyone, but I could see the weight pressing on his shoulders. He worked late nights, his voice hoarse from phone calls, his brow furrowed in ways I had never seen before. And then, almost as if on cue, the whispers about me grew louder. His cousin, the villain I now understood too well, seized the moment. He stood in rooms filled with relatives and shareholders, his voice low but steady, and he pointed the blame at me. "Ever since she arrived," he said, "things have gone downhill. She's a distraction. She doesn't understand business. She doesn't belong here." At first, my husband defended me, fiercely. He told them I had nothing to do with the company's struggles. But doubt is like a stain. It spreads, even when you scrub at it. Soon, the family wasn't just whispering. They were demanding. His mother cornered me one evening, her voice trembling with both anger and fear. "You've brought bad luck into this house. Our company is crumbling, and it's because of you." I stood there, her words striking me like blows, but I said nothing. How could I? I had no proof, no way to defend myself against accusations built on shadows. I wanted to scream that it wasn't me, that someone else was pulling the strings, but I knew they wouldn't believe me. The truth was worse than I could have imagined. The cousin wasn't just spreading rumors. He was actively sabotaging the company. I noticed patterns no one else seemed to see. Decisions that looked small on paper but had devastating consequences, contracts signed with suspicious terms, vendors chosen who always failed to deliver. I saw the fingerprints of betrayal, but they were faint, hidden beneath layers of business jargon and clever lies. Late at night, while my husband slept, I sat at the kitchen table with papers spread before me. I wasn't a businesswoman, but I was a mechanic, and mechanics know this. Every machine, no matter how complicated, is built from simple parts. If something doesn't work, you trace the problem back to its smallest fault. I began to look at the company the same way, as a machine. Something was wrong, and if I could just find the loose bolt, the misaligned gear, I could fix it. But while I searched for answers, the family turned colder. At dinners, conversation stopped when I spoke. The sister who once ignored me now sneered openly. The mother refused to sit beside me. Even distant relatives began to treat me like an intruder. My presence was a wound they wanted to heal by cutting me out. I felt like I was drowning, torn between the man I loved who was fighting battles I couldn't see, and the family who wanted me gone. Suspense became my companion. Every day I wondered when the next accusation would come, when the next blow would fall. And yet in the quiet of those long nights, I made myself a promise. If they wanted to call me an outsider, so be it. But I would not leave him to fight this war alone. I would find the truth. I would uncover the betrayal. And when I did, they would all see who I really was. The night I found the proof, I remember my hands trembling as if I had been the one caught stealing. For weeks, I had been poring over files, reports, contracts, things I barely understood at first glance. But slowly, patterns emerged, numbers that didn't add up, decisions that led to failure, but benefited one man in silence. It was like looking at a car engine where every part had been sabotaged, bolts loosened, wires cut, fluids drained, all designed to break at the worst possible moment. The cousin, the so-called loyal family member, had been orchestrating it all. He signed deals that quietly drained money into accounts overseas. He recommended suppliers that always failed, forcing the company to spend twice as much on repairs. He leaked information to competitors, watching gleefully as contracts slipped from our fingers. And through it all, he pointed to me as the distraction, the supposed curse. I remember sitting there, staring at the papers, tears filling my eyes. Not because I was surprised at his betrayal, but because I finally had what I needed. Proof. Evidence. A weapon. For the first time in months, I felt the weight in my chest begin to lift. I wasn't crazy. I wasn't the problem. I wasn't the gold digger they painted me to be. The next morning, I showed it to my husband. He looked at the documents in silence, his jaw tightening with every page. When he finally lifted his eyes to mine, there was no doubt, no hesitation, only anger. "You did this?" he whispered, not in accusation, but in awe. "You uncovered this on your own?" I nodded. I just looked at it the way I look at a broken car. If something doesn't run, you find the fault. And this company, it's been running on lies. He kissed my forehead and pulled me into his arms. "You saved us," he said, his voice breaking. But it wasn't over yet. We needed to expose him, not just to the family, but to the board, the employees, the very people who had begun to lose faith. That evening, my husband called a meeting. The cousin arrived confident, his smirk wide, his eyes shining with the certainty of victory. But as the documents were laid bare, page after page, his smirk faltered. Gasps filled the room. The family looked from him to me, their faces pale with realization. For months they had called me the problem. For months they had believed his lies. And now, in the harsh light of truth, they saw him for what he was. He tried to protest, to twist his words, but the evidence was undeniable. His empire of lies collapsed in a single moment. Security was called. He left that night disgraced, his name stripped of honor, his schemes turned to ashes. As for me, I stood quietly at my husband's side. I didn't gloat. I didn't say, "I told you so." I simply breathed, for the first time in months, like I was no longer drowning. And when my husband's hand slipped into mine, warm and steady, I knew this was not just a victory for the company, it was a victory for us. The days that followed felt almost unreal, as though I had stepped into someone else's life. For so long, I had been the shadow at the table, the outsider whose presence was barely tolerated. But now, everything had shifted. The family that once whispered behind my back began to meet my eyes directly. Their voices, once sharp with suspicion, softened with something that felt like respect. It wasn't immediate acceptance. Years of judgment don't vanish overnight, but it was the beginning of something I had thought impossible. I remember one moment vividly. We were at another family dinner, the kind that had once filled me with dread. Plates were passed, glasses clinked, and for the first time in months, the air wasn't poisoned with hostility. My husband stood, his voice steady as he addressed the room. "This company," he said, "would not be standing here today without Tanya. She saw what none of us saw. She had the courage to act when all of us were blind. I owe her not only my gratitude, but my faith." And so does this family silence followed his words, the kind of silence that weighs heavy. Then, slowly, his mother nodded. She didn't speak. She rarely did when it came to me, but the look in her eyes had changed. It wasn't warmth yet, but it was no longer cold. His sister offered a smile, small but genuine. For me, that was enough. It meant the tide had turned. But the transformation wasn't just in them, it was in me too. I no longer walked with my head bowed, no longer shrank from their stares. I carried myself with the quiet confidence of someone who had faced doubt and proven stronger. I had saved not just a company but my own place in this family. And in saving them, I had saved myself. The villain was gone, his name now synonymous with betrayal. The company began to heal, contracts restored, trust rebuilt. My husband included me in discussions, asking for my opinions, valuing the perspective I once thought had no place in his world. And though I never wanted to control his empire, I realized something important. I had always belonged here, not because of wealth or status, but because of who I was. One evening, as we sat together after a long day, he turned to me and said, "You know, they'll never call you a gold digger again." I smiled softly. "They'll find another name. People always do." He shook his head. "No, now, they'll call you what I've always known you are. The heart of this family." Tears pricked my eyes, but I didn't let them fall. Because deep down, I knew this was only the beginning. Respect, once earned, cannot be taken away. And love, when forged in fire, only grows stronger. I was once just a mechanic, a woman dismissed as simple, but in the end, it was my simplicity that became my strength, my ability to see clearly when others were blinded by greed and pride, and that, more than anything, is what earned me a place in this family forever. When I look back now, it almost feels like a different lifetime. I still remember the girl I used to be, the mechanic in coveralls, wiping sweat from her brow in a dusty garage, never imagining that her life could stretch beyond the smell of oil and steel. That girl was called simple, ordinary, forgettable. And maybe that's exactly what made her unforgettable. I learned that being underestimated is not a curse. It's a gift. Because when people dismiss you, they never see you coming. They don't notice the way you observe, the way you think, the way you prepare. They only see their idea of you, not your truth. And one day, when the moment arrives, you step forward and prove them wrong. Not with anger, not with noise, but with quiet brilliance. The family that once doubted me now calls me their own. The company that almost collapsed is thriving again. And the man I married? He doesn't just love me, he respects me. That respect is the foundation of everything we've built together. But the most important transformation wasn't theirs. It was mine. I stopped seeing myself as the outsider. I stopped believing I wasn't enough. I discovered that my simplicity was never weakness. It was clarity. It was strength. So if you take anything from my story, let it be this. You don't need to be loud to be powerful. You don't need to be polished to be valuable. And you don't need the world's approval to know your worth. Sometimes the very things people mock you for become the very things that save you, and them. If this story touched you, if it reminded you that resilience lives in the simplest hearts, then don't keep it to yourself. Hit that like button, subscribe for more stories that reveal the power of ordinary people doing extraordinary things, and share this with someone who needs to hear that their simplicity is their superpower. Because maybe, just maybe, the world's next great savior isn't sitting in a boardroom. Maybe she's standing in a garage with grease on her hands and fire in her soul.